Hey there, welcome back for another deep dive. As someone who loves to really get to the bottom of things, I think you're going to love this one. We're going to be tackling a pretty big question today.
Oh yeah, a really fundamental one.
What is knowledge?
Ah, yes.
And to help us unpack this, we're turning to one of the giants of philosophy.
We're going with Plato today.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And specifically, his dialogue, Theaetetus, which is considered like his most important work on, the theory of knowledge, epistemology.
hmm
And to help us navigate this, we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the Theaetetus.
Yeah, it's a really dense text, so having that kind of secondary source to help us unpack it is going to be super helpful. And I think, for you as a learner, one of the things that's going to be really interesting about this is that even though we don't get a definitive answer in the Theaetetus,
Right.
the journey itself is so insightful. We're going to learn a lot about different ways of thinking about knowledge and why some of those ways don't quite work.
Yeah. And the fact that it ends in this kind of impasse, this aporia, as it's called in Greek,
Right.
actually tells us something pretty profound about the nature of knowledge itself. Like,
Yeah.
maybe there isn't one simple answer.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so thought-provoking.
Yeah. And what makes this particularly intriguing, I think, is the character of Theaetetus himself. And this is a brilliant young mathematician.
Right. Someone who, in theory, is dealing with these absolute demonstrable truths.
Exactly. Like the epitome of someone who's got knowledge, right? So the fact that even he struggles to define what knowledge is
Yeah.
really makes you wonder, like, how slippery this concept actually is.
Yeah. And it speaks to the idea that, maybe no single discipline, no matter how rigorous, can fully capture what knowledge is.
It's a really humbling thought, I think, for anyone who's, trying to learn and grow.
Absolutely.
And before we dive into the meat of the dialogue, I think it's worth mentioning how it's set up. We've got this framing conversation between Euclides and Terpsichore, where Euclides is basically presenting this written account of a conversation that Socrates had with Theaetetus years earlier.
Right. And it's kind of like Socrates, he's not even there physically.
Yeah, he's a legend by this point.
Exactly. But his presence is still so strong.
Right. And it emphasizes, I think, how important this particular discussion was for Plato.
Oh, absolutely. This is like the heart of his philosophical project.
So with that in mind, let's get into it. What's the first thing that Theaetetus throws out there as a possible definition of knowledge?
Well, Theaetetus starts off kind of, intuitively. He just gives examples.
Okay.
He's like, well, knowledge is, geometry, it's astronomy, harmony, arithmetic. He lists all these different fields.
Right, like the things that you would study.
Exactly. Yeah, the things that you would learn in school.
Okay. But Socrates, never one to take things at face value. He's like, not so fast.
Yeah, Socrates kind of pokes at that. He's like, okay, but is that really telling us what knowledge is? Or is it just giving us examples of what we consider to be knowledge?
Right, like, is it a definition or just a bunch of things we call knowledge?
Exactly. And this is really important for you as a learner because it points to the difference between just knowing a bunch of facts and understanding what it means to know something. Like, we could spend all day listing examples, but that's not going to get us to the heart of the matter.
Yeah, it's like I could tell you I know how to ride a bike, I know how to speak English,
Right, exactly.
but does that really tell you what knowledge is?
It's a really slippery concept, And Socrates even points out you could just go on listing examples forever. It becomes this interminable diversion. You never actually arrive at the definition.
Right, right. So Socrates is trying to guide Theaetetus towards a better understanding of what it means to define something.
Exactly. And he uses this really great analogy to explain his method. He compares himself to a midwife.
A midwife.
Yeah, but instead of helping to bring babies into the world,
Right.
he helps to bring ideas into the world.
I love that.
Right, it's such a great image. And the key thing here is that he doesn't claim to have all the answers himself.
Yeah.
Just like a midwife doesn't create the baby.
Right, right.
His role is to assist in the process, to ask the right questions, to help people articulate their thoughts, and then really examine those thoughts critically. And he actually says that his role is even better than a midwife's.
Why is that?
Because he can tell whether the idea that's being born is true or false, or at least he thinks he can.
Okay, so he's like a midwife, but with like a truth detector built in.
Yeah, exactly. And the big takeaway here for you is that Socrates sees this process of struggle, this, kind of going back and forth, even getting stuck, this aporia, as it's called,
Right.
as essential to learning. It's when you realize you don't know something
Yeah.
that you really start to seek understanding.
Right, like you got to hit that wall before you can break through it. Okay, so with Socrates' guidance, Theaetetus comes up with his first real definition. He says, knowledge is perception. What's Socrates' reaction to that?
Well, Socrates being Socrates, he doesn't just tackle that idea head on.
Right.
He links it to these other big ideas floating around at the time.
Yeah.
He connects it to Protagoras' famous saying, man is the measure of all things, and to Heraclitus' doctrine of all is flux.
Okay, I'm familiar with those, but maybe you could just give us a quick refresher on what those ideas actually mean.
Yeah, absolutely. So Protagoras' man is the measure basically means that truth is relative to each individual.
Right.
There's no objective truth out there. What's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. And that's based on our individual perception.
Okay, so it's like if I see the sky as blue and you see it as more greenish blue, we're both right.
Yeah, exactly. And Socrates really emphasizes this point about the Greek word hos in Protagoras' statement. It's not just about the object itself, but how it appears to the individual subject.
Okay, so it's all about subjective experience.
Yeah. And then with Heraclitus, it's the idea that everything is constantly changing. There's nothing that stays the same. It's all in flux.
Right, like the famous saying, you can't step into the same river twice.
Exactly. So Socrates is basically saying if knowledge is just perception and our perceptions are constantly changing, then there can't be any stable objects of knowledge.
Interesting.
Yeah, it kind of throws a wrench into the whole idea of knowing anything for sure, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
So how does Socrates start to challenge this whole knowledge is perception idea?
Well, he uses a bunch of different arguments. I think he throws out like 12 objections in total.
12. Wow, okay.
Yeah, he goes all in. He brings up things like, the difference between animal perception and human perception.
Okay, like a dog sees the world differently than we do.
Exactly. And if all perception is knowledge, then why do we think human perception is somehow better?
Right.
And then he talks about how if everyone's perceptions are true, then no one can really be wiser than anyone else.
Yeah, because everyone's just seeing their own truth.
Exactly. And he even brings in the idea of the gods.
Okay.
Like, do the gods perceive things differently than we do? And if so, is their perception somehow more true?
Interesting.
Yeah, he really covers a lot of ground. He talks about understanding language, the role of memory,
Yep.
the fact that you can know something even when you're not actively perceiving it.
Right.
There's even this great example of the covered eye.
The covered eye, what's that?
So imagine you cover one of your eyes.
Okay.
You can still see the object, right? But you're only perceiving it with one eye.
Right.
So do you both know and not know the object at the same time?
It's like a little philosophical riddle.
Exactly. And all of these objections are basically showing that perception alone can't account for all the different ways we use and understand the concept of knowledge.
Right. It's more complex than just seeing or hearing or touching something.
Much more complex.
Okay. So after Socrates throws out all these objections, does Protagoras get a chance to defend himself?
He does. There's this section called the Apology of Protagoras, where Socrates basically presents what he thinks Protagoras would say in response.
Okay, so it's like Socrates is putting words in Protagoras' mouth.
In a way, yeah. But he's doing it, philosophically, trying to represent Protagoras' views fairly. And one of the key things Protagoras argues is that teachers aren't actually giving their students true beliefs in place of false ones.
Okay.
Because for Protagoras, remember, all beliefs are true for the person who holds them.
Right.
So the goal of teaching is more like a doctor treating a patient.
Interesting.
It's about using arguments and persuasion, almost like medicine, to change the state of someone's soul.
Okay.
So you're not trying to replace a false belief with a true one. You're trying to shift someone's perspective so that good things appear to them instead of bad things.
Okay, so it's more about what's beneficial or useful, not about objective truth.
Exactly. And this is a really important point for you to consider as a learner. Like, what's the ultimate goal of learning? Is it about acquiring true beliefs? Or is it about developing a certain kind of mindset or worldview?
Yeah, that's a great question.
It really makes you think about the purpose of education and what we're trying to achieve.
And of course, Plato, through Socrates, he has a different view. He's all about truth, even if it's not always pretty or convenient.
Yeah, he's after something deeper, something that transcends individual perspective.
Okay. And then there's this really clever argument that Socrates uses against Protagoras, the paratropy, the table-turning argument. What's that all about?
Oh, this is a classic. It's a self-refutation argument.
Okay, sounds dangerous.
Basically, Socrates points out that if Protagoras' statement, all beliefs are true, is itself a belief,
Right.
then it must also be true that not all beliefs are true.
Okay, I'm starting to see how the table is turning here.
Right, because if all beliefs are true, then the belief that not all beliefs are true must also be true. But if that's true, then Protagoras' original statement can't be true.
Right, it's like a logical paradox.
Exactly. It's a really elegant way of showing how Protagoras' own claim undermines itself.
So 1 point for Socrates there.
Yeah, he scores a pretty decisive point there.
And then there's that ninth objection about justice and what's good for cities. Can you unpack that one a bit?
Yeah, so here Socrates is basically challenging Protagoras to think about the implications of his relativism for political life.
Right.
Like, if there's no objective truth, then what does that mean for things like justice and laws?
Right, because those things are supposed to apply to everyone.
Exactly. And Socrates points out that Protagoras has to make a choice. Either his relativism applies to everything, even what's good for a city, or he has to separate justice and benefit somehow.
Okay.
But either option is tricky. If everything is relative, then even what's beneficial for a city becomes a matter of opinion, which could lead to some pretty chaotic outcomes. But if he separates justice and benefit, then he's admitting that there are some things that are objectively good or bad, which kind of contradicts his whole philosophy.
Yeah, it's a tough spot.
Yeah.
And I think this actually leads into that famous digression section, right?
Yeah, you're right. The digression comes right after this.
And that's where things get really interesting, I think. It's like a whole other layer to the dialogue.
Absolutely.
So what's the purpose of this digression? Why does Plato throw this in here?
That's a question that scholars are still debating. But one interpretation is that it's a kind of critique of separating justice and benefit, like Protagoras was suggesting.
Okay.
Socrates contrasts the life of a philosopher, someone who's dedicated to pursuing truth,
Right.
with the life of a rhetorician, someone who's more focused on persuasion and winning arguments.
Okay.
And he kind of paints this funny picture of the philosopher as this, like, absent-minded professor type.
Right, like the classic image of the philosopher staring up at the stars and falling into a well.
Exactly. But Plato's point is that even though the philosopher might seem out of touch with practical matters,
Yeah.
they're actually the ones who are most beneficial to society in the long run.
Because they're seeking truth and understanding.
Exactly. And truth and understanding, that's what ultimately leads to justice and a well-ordered society.
Right, so it's like a long game versus a short game.
Yeah, and the digression also brings up this important idea of assimilation to God.
Assimilation to God. Okay, what does that mean?
Basically, it's the idea that our goal should be to become as godlike as possible.
But not in a, like, superpowers kind of way, right?
No, not at all. It's about cultivating virtue and wisdom.
Okay.
It's about aligning ourselves with what's truly good and just, which Plato sees as being embodied in the divine.
So it's about living a good life, essentially.
Yeah, a life that's in harmony with the highest principles. And there's even debate about whether this section subtly hints at Plato's theory of forms.
Right, the idea that there are these perfect eternal essences that exist beyond the physical world.
Yeah. And that our souls can somehow access these forms through reason and contemplation.
Okay, so even though the digression seems like a bit of a detour, it's actually really important for understanding Plato's overall philosophy.
Absolutely. It ties everything together. It shows how the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of truth, is ultimately connected to living a virtuous and meaningful life.
Okay, and then after the digression, we get back to the main line of argument. And Socrates throws out some final objections to both Protagoras and Heraclitus, right?
He does, yeah. He wants to make sure he's addressed all the angles.
Okay, so what are these final objections?
So with Protagoras, he focuses on the problem of making judgments about the future. Like, if all beliefs are true, then how can we ever say that a prediction was wrong?
Right, because in the moment you made the prediction, you believed it to be true.
Exactly. So Socrates suggests that Protagoras might have to argue that the future is simply as we currently believe it to be, which seems a little strange.
Yeah, because it takes away any possibility of being wrong about the future.
Exactly. And then with Heraclitus, he tackles the doctrine of flux head-on. He argues that if everything is constantly changing in every way, then it becomes impossible to make any meaningful statement about anything.
Right, because by the time you finish the sentence, the thing you're talking about has already changed.
Exactly. And he offers two versions of this argument. one with two kinds of flux and one with, like, infinitely many kinds.
Okay, so he's really trying to show how the idea of universal flux leads to some serious logical problems.
Yeah, he's basically saying that if you take Heraclitus's idea to its extreme, you end up in a situation where you can't even talk about anything coherently.
Which kind of defeats the purpose of philosophy, right?
Yeah, it undermines the whole enterprise of trying to understand the world.
Okay, so Socrates has pretty much demolished both Protagoras and Heraclitus at this point.
Hmm.
And then comes this really important moment where he introduces the koina.
Right, the common notions.
And this is like the final nail in the coffin for the knowledge is perception argument, right?
Yeah, this is where it all comes together.
So what are these koinas?
The koina are these fundamental concepts like existence, sameness, difference, unity, plurality, likeness, unlikeness, even things like beauty and ugliness.
Okay.
And Socrates argues that these are not things that we get from our senses.
Right. You don't see sameness or touch existence.
Exactly. And this is a crucial point for you as a learner because it suggests that there's more to knowledge than just sensory experience.
Okay.
There's this aspect of our minds that seems to grasp these fundamental concepts, these koina, that are beyond the realm of the senses.
Yeah.
And it's through these concepts that we're able to make judgments about the world.
Right. Like when I say this apple is red, I'm not just perceiving the color red.
Right.
I'm also using the concept of redness, which is something that my mind brings to the experience.
Exactly. And that's what the koina are all about. They're these fundamental building blocks of thought that allow us to make sense of the world.
Okay, so the introduction of the koina really shifts the focus from perception to judgment to the way our minds process and interpret information.
Yeah, it highlights this active role that our minds play in constructing knowledge. And while Plato doesn't explicitly say in the Theaetetus that these koina are his forms,
Right.
it does kind of point in that direction, doesn't it?
Yeah, it definitely seems like a precursor to that idea.
And the implications are huge because if there are these fundamental concepts that exist independently of our individual perceptions, then knowledge becomes something much more than just a subjective experience.
Right, it becomes something that's grounded in something more objective, more universal.
Exactly.
Okay? So knowledge is perception is officially off the table.
It's been thoroughly dismantled.
And Theaetetus comes up with a new definition. Knowledge is true judgment or true belief.
Right. Which seems like a step in the right direction. Right.
Yeah, it's getting closer, I think. But what's the problem with this definition?
Well, the problem is that it doesn't really account for the possibility of false belief.
Right, because we all have beliefs that turn out to be wrong.
Exactly. And if knowledge is just believing what's true, then how do we explain the fact that we can hold false beliefs?
That's a good point.
It becomes this kind of paradox. And Plato is really interested in this. He wants to understand how we can be wrong about things.
It's a very human problem, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And he's trying to show that just relying on sensory experience doesn't give us a good explanation for how we form beliefs, especially false ones.
Okay.
So he comes up with these 5 puzzles to try to illustrate this problem.
5 puzzles. Okay, I'm intrigued. Can
Yeah.
you give us a taste of what some of these puzzles are like?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first puzzle is all about misidentification. Like, how can you mistake one thing you know for another thing you also know?
Yeah.
Like, if you know both Socrates and Theaetetus, how could you possibly think that Socrates is Theaetetus?
Right. It seems like a very basic mistake.
It does, yeah. And yet we do this all the time.
We do.
So how is that possible if knowledge is just true belief?
Right.
And then the second puzzle deals with the idea of believing what is not.
Believing what is not. Okay, that sounds a little abstract.
It is, yeah. It's basically the idea that if you have a false belief, you must be believing in something that doesn't exist.
Okay.
Which leads to this strange conclusion that false beliefs are beliefs about nothing.
Okay. I could see how that would be a problem.
Yeah, it doesn't quite make sense, does it?
Not really.
And then the third puzzle, which is called allodoxia,
Allodoxia.
is all about this idea of like swapping one thought for another in your mind.
Okay.
Like you're thinking about one thing and then you accidentally think about something else instead.
Okay.
And Socrates is trying to figure out how that's even possible if our thoughts are just a reflection of what we know.
Right, like if you know something, shouldn't you be able to think about it clearly without any mix-ups?
Exactly. But the fact that we do make these kinds of mistakes suggests that there's more going on in our minds than just like passively receiving information.
Right, there's some kind of active process happening.
Yeah, there's something else at play.
Okay, and then we get to those two famous analogies, the wax tablet and the aviary.
Ah, yes, the analogies.
These are like Plato trying to create a model for how false belief could work.
Yeah, he's trying to visualize it.
So how did these analogies work?
So with the wax tablet, the idea is that our minds are like these wax tablets, and perceptions and thoughts make impressions on the wax.
Okay,
And memory is like these impressions that stay in the wax.
right.
But sometimes you try to fit the wrong impression into a slot, and that's how you get a false belief.
Okay, I like that. It's very visual.
It is, yeah. But Socrates points out a big problem with this analogy.
What's that?
It can't explain false beliefs that don't involve perception.
Okay, like what?
Like, if you make a mistake in a math calculation, you're not misperceiving anything.
Right, it's a purely mental error.
Exactly. So the wax tablet analogy breaks down there.
Okay, what about the aviary analogy?
So the aviary analogy is the idea that our minds are like these aviaries full of birds, and each bird represents a piece of knowledge.
Okay.
And when you want to recall something, you reach into the aviary and grab a bird.
Okay,
But sometimes you grab the wrong bird, and that's how you get a false belief.
I see. You're grabbing a piece of knowledge that's not the one you're looking for.
Exactly. But this analogy also has some problems.
Like what?
Well, it doesn't really explain how you could confuse one bird for another in the first place. Like, how do you mistake one piece of knowledge for another?
Right, if you know something, shouldn't you be able to recognize it?
Exactly. And Theaetetus even suggests adding ignorance birds to the aviary.
Ignorance, birds.
Yeah, like birds that represent things you don't know. But Socrates argues that this doesn't really solve the problem, it just pushes it back a step.
Right, because now you have to explain how you mistake an ignorance bird for a knowledge bird.
Exactly.
So both of these analogies, they're really interesting, but they ultimately don't quite work.
Yeah, they can't fully account for the possibility of false belief.
Which brings us to the final refutation of knowledge is true judgment. And this one involves the Athenian jurymen, right?
It does, yeah. This is a great example.
So what's the point of this example?
Socrates is basically saying that a skilled lawyer can persuade a jury to believe something that's true, even if they don't have any real knowledge of the facts of the case.
Okay.
So the jurymen end up with a true belief, but it's based on rhetoric and persuasion, not on any kind of firsthand understanding.
Right, so they've been convinced, but they haven't really learned anything.
Exactly. And this is a really important distinction for you to consider as a learner, because it suggests that just believing something that's true, even if you're persuaded by a really smart person, isn't the same as having knowledge.
Right, there's something more to it than that.
Yeah, there's this element of understanding, of being able to justify your belief that's missing.
Okay, so knowledge is true judgment is also out.
It's been refuted.
And we're on to the third and final definition. Knowledge is true judgment with an account, or true belief accompanied by a logos.
Right. This is the culmination of the dialogue.
And this one seems like it's getting pretty close to what we might consider a good definition of knowledge, right?
It does, yeah. It seems like it's addressing that missing element that we were just talking about.
Right, the need for justification for understanding.
Exactly. But even this definition isn't without its problems.
Okay, so what are the issues with this one?
Well, first of all, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem of false belief that we were grappling with before.
Right, because if we don't know how we could be wrong in the first place, then just adding an account to a true belief doesn't really address the underlying issue.
Exactly. It's kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a deeper wound.
I see.
And there's also this ongoing debate about whether this part of the dialogue is focused on objectual knowledge, like knowing of things, or propositional knowledge, like knowing that certain statements are true.
Right, it's like, are we talking about knowing things in the world or knowing facts about the world?
Exactly. And the distinction can be tricky. And interestingly, Plato himself seems to advocate for something like true belief with an account in other dialogues, like the Melino,
Okay.
which leads some scholars to believe that maybe the aporia we reach here in the Theaetetus
Right.
is a deliberate strategy on Plato's part. Like, maybe he's trying to show that certain kinds of accounts, certain kinds of justifications just don't cut it when it comes to knowledge.
That's interesting. So even though he might endorse something like this definition elsewhere, here he's really putting it through the ringer.
Exactly. He's testing its limits.
Okay. And then we get this really intriguing section, the dream of Socrates, or the dream theory. What's that all about?
Ah, yes, the dream theory. This is a fascinating part of the dialogue. Basically, it tries to spell out what this account, this logos, actually means.
Okay.
And the idea is that an account involves analyzing complex things into their simple, fundamental elements.
Hmm?
So we can only truly know the complexes, but our understanding of the simples is limited to perception.
Okay, so it's like we can know a house because we can break it down into its parts, like walls and doors and windows.
Exactly.
But we can't really know the essence of wallness or doorness. We just perceive those things.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And some scholars think that this theory is a kind of response to the philosopher Antisthenes,
Okay.
who was a critic of Plato's theory of forms and really emphasized the importance of definable individual qualities.
Right, so it's like a different way of thinking about knowledge, one that's more grounded in the particular.
Exactly. But Socrates, he's not convinced by the dream theory.
Of course not. He always has a counter-argument up his sleeve.
He does, yeah. He uses this clever dilemma to challenge it.
Okay, what's the dilemma?
He says, okay, let's take a complex thing, like a syllable.
Okay.
Is it just the sum of its elements, the letters?
Okay.
Or is it something more than that?
Right, because a syllable has a sound, a meaning, that goes beyond just the individual letters.
Exactly. And Socrates argues that either way you go with this, you run into problems.
Okay.
If a syllable is just its letters, then you can't really know the syllable without knowing all the letters perfectly.
Right.
But if it's something more than the letters, then you can't know the syllable just by knowing the letters.
Okay, I see. It's a bit of a head spinner.
It is, yeah. It's one of those philosophical puzzles that makes you really think about how language and knowledge work.
And Plato also makes this simpler point, based on how we actually learn things.
Yeah, he says that we usually learn the elements before we learn the complexes.
Right, like we learn the alphabet before we learn how to read.
Exactly. And that kind of contradicts the dream theory's idea that knowledge is primarily of the complexes.
Okay, so the dream theory doesn't quite hold up. Expert speaker.